Hi everyone, and welcome to the CBP Education Team's Ask an Expert webinar, Finding Best Fit MBTI Types. We have about 860 people registered today. My name is Karen Gonzalez, and I'm the Associate Marketing Manager here at CBP. I'll be moderating today's webinar. But first, I'd like to do a quick walkthrough of the webinar format. Today's webinar will run for approximately 90 minutes. During the presentation, if you have questions, please submit them to me using the question function in the webinar controls. Judy Gruder will be pausing throughout the webinar today to answer your questions, and I'll give everyone a chance to send in their questions during these breaks. We have one representative from CBP's education team in attendance, Jim Larkin, and he'll be available to answer questions as well. As with all of our webinars, today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll send out a link to the recording in approximately 2 weeks. Please note that the PowerPoint slides are not available for the Ask an Expert series. Now, we actually have a contest going on today. Before I introduce Judy Gruder, I thought that we should end the 2013 series with a bang. So here it is. What we're going to be doing today is we have the top 5 tweeters to send in the most tweets will win this limited edition MBTI anniversary tumbler. So we thought it was kind of cute to give this away as we're celebrating the 70th anniversary of the MBTI assessment. Now, here are the rules. So just go on to Twitter, follow @CBP Education. Make sure that you use hashtag CBPAAE in all of your tweets. This is how we can track all of the tweets that you send in. Now, one of the things is don't send any repeat tweets because we won't count those. The contest will go through today, and it's going to end at 1 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And I will go ahead and announce the winner on Twitter, and we'll send out a little direct message to you. So now that I've said that, I'd like to introduce our expert. I'm very happy to welcome at CBP's Ask an Expert, Judy Gruder, GS Principal and Trainer. Judy has been a Career Development Program Consultant and Trainer for more than 35 years, as well as a National Certified Counselor and NCDA Master Career Counselor. She's a recognized authority on the uses of assessments in career counseling and is co-author of a number of publications and reports on the Strong Interest Inventory, such as the I Start Strong Report and Myers-Briggs tools. Now, please join me in welcoming Judy, and now I'd like to turn over the webinar to her. Welcome, Judy.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. Sounds like a really fun contest. I wish I had a tumbler right here to drink out of as we're doing this. We're closing this year's Ask an Expert series with a very important topic. How do we help students and clients find their best fit type? We're going to look at this from 2 different aspects. I'm going to start the first part of the webinar is going to be kind of the basics of how we do this, and then we're going to introduce some TypeDynamics and type development material. The MBTI instrument isn't like the other assessments that most of us use in career counseling. First of all, it doesn't measure anything. It doesn't tell how much of anything we have. It uses dichotomies instead of scales, and it sorts preferences for one pole over another. And because it doesn't use scales, the numbers that appear on the profile are indexes, not scores. They're called Preference Clarity Indexes, or PCEyes, and tell us how consistently respondents answered in one direction over the other, how likely it is that respondents will come out the same if they retake the assessment. In most cases, the clearer the preference or the higher the PCEye, the easier it will be to identify a best fit type. And respondents' results are not outcomes. How someone comes out on the assessment is the starting point for identifying best fit type. One of the most basic guidelines for providing feedback on type is that reported type has to be verified by respondents. It never stands alone. In fact, assessment results are not usually shared with respondents until after an estimated type has been reached. Now, the most important factors in finding respondents' best fit types are how the assessment is administered and how feedback is given, and we're going to look at both. More often than not, respondents will be more likely to uncover a best fit type if they understand what type is and why they're taking the assessment. I follow these steps, which are based pretty much on what's suggested in the manual. First, we explain that type is about how we prefer to process information and make decisions, what gives us the most energy, and how we like to live our daily lives. The instrument describes our natural strengths and is in no way prescriptive or diagnostic. There are no right or wrong, good or bad results. We explain that each question presents two options and that they're not always easy to choose between. Many will not appear to be logically opposite, so try to choose the option that's the most natural for you, and be very careful here not to indicate that they should answer according to how they are at work or how they are when they're not at work. Types are very different in this regard. Explain that part of the process will be discussing their results to make sure that they agree. Explain how the results are going to be used in career counseling to explore work tasks and environments, in academic advising to explore majors that are a good fit or any other purpose, and emphasize that the results are confidential and belong only to them and won't be shared with anyone else. After the assessment has been completed and scored, the recommended feedback process looks something like this. The practitioner defines what type is again and describes each preference pair, referencing key descriptors from the manual, or I use the Introduction to Type booklet. Respondents are asked to share how each preference in each pair is evident in their lives and to estimate which preference is the most natural. What we're emphasizing here is that all 8 preferences are apparent in everyone, but that some are more natural than others. Respondents are then asked to consider which preference they use most frequently in school or at work, and to share how natural those preferences feel. There's a document in the manual and an introduction to type called The Effects of the MBTI Preferences in Work Settings, which is really helpful to use for this section. I've recorded my own type here. I use both E and I and T and F a lot in my work, and actually when I was first introduced to type, I wasn't sure which was more natural. Now at this point, the actual reported results, how they came out on the indicator, are shared, and discrepancies are discussed between what they've estimated, what they've already recorded, and how they're actually coming out on the assessment. And hopefully best fit type is identified. I've noticed over years and years of doing this that sensing types tend to look at each preference pair and see which letter occurs most frequently in this little chart. Those who prefer intuition will say so, even if the data don't add up. Now at this point, we usually have them verify their type by looking over this chart. This is also in the manual and many type publications. And if their best fit agrees with their reported type, the next step would be to take them through the type description in whatever report you're using. Either here or earlier, emphasize that type isn't in any way exclusive. Preferring one type doesn't exclude having characteristics of the other 15. In fact, the more comfortable we are with our own type, the more easily we'll be able to access the others when it's appropriate or necessary to do so. I've always liked Susan Brock's description of type as a 16-room house. We all have a favorite room in our house or spot in our apartment, but we certainly go in and out of every room. My ENFP husband used to say that his favorite part of the house was in front of the fireplace in the living room, where he could gather with friends and share stories. My favorite INTJ room, not surprisingly, is my office, with all of my books and computers. We spent most of the time together in the dominant intuition that our two types shared, which happened to be the kitchen. Now, if respondents' best fit and reported types are different, I'll have them review the full-page descriptions and introduction to type and either highlight what describes them in each description or cross out anything that doesn't. Feeling types usually like to highlight, by the way, and thinking types like to cross out. When this process is followed, most students and clients will be able to identify a best fit type, but not always. And what we're going to talk about first today are some easy techniques to use when you're helping them to estimate their type, and then how TypeDynamics come into the picture, some different lenses that we can use to help them to explore. The most important part of determining best fit type is how the preference pairs are explained. It's from your explanation that respondents will estimate their type, and so you want it to be clear and personalized. These are the points to keep in mind as you're talking about the preferences. I'm going to make the points here, and then afterwards I'll give some specific examples of how to do each. You have the reported results. The respondent doesn't. If all 4 preference pairs are clear, choose the order for presenting them that's the most relevant to why they're taking the assessment. It's pretty common to take them in order of the profile, EI, SN, TF, and JP. If they're not clear, you'll probably want to consider various type table configurations to determine which will be the most helpful in the explanation. I actually only have one rule about where to start. It just doesn't make sense to describe TF before you've talked about SN. So sometimes I'll start with EI, sometimes with JP, sometimes with SN, but there isn't ever any reason to start with TF. TF is about the criteria that we use to evaluate the worth of SN information. It can't stand alone. Now have some keywords and phrases to use as examples of each pair. This isn't the time to be anecdotal. Stick to words and phrases that have been shown by research to truly define the preferences. I actually stick pretty close to the definitions in Introduction to Type, and I'll actually show you a script that I use a little bit later. And I usually have the booklet open so that the respondent can read the words as I'm saying them. As you describe each preference pair, ask questions to elicit examples of each preference from respondents' own lives. By this time, you'll most likely have a sense of how to pace the examples and questioning. You'll also have the reported type as a starting point. Adjust for discussion and reflection according to extroversion and introversion. And listen for how the respondent phrases things so that if a preference isn't clear, you can share what you've heard. We'll take these one at a time and talk about some examples. We'll talk about different orders for presenting the pairs, but first you want to lay out the overall picture and explain how the preferences are not exclusive. We all use them all. If you're going to talk about the preferences in an order other than how they're presented on the profile, mention why. Sensing types especially will be confused if you start in the middle without an apparent reason for doing so. So what do we do when type isn't clear, when respondents can't decide? We'll briefly look at 3 different ways to verify type here. You can learn a lot more about this in the MBTI manual and in certification programs. We can pair letters in the type to form type table configurations, the columns, the quadrants, the temperaments, the rows, etc. We can listen for and explain type dynamics. What part of the type is extroverted, what part is introverted, what part of the type shows up when the person is under stress, things like that. And we can administer and interpret the MBTI Step 2, which adds 20 subscales, we call them facets, to the 4 preference pairs. When I'm helping people to estimate their type, this what we call the self-selection process, I like to use a worksheet with horizontal lines. Excuse me, I had to clear my throat. I like to use a worksheet with horizontal lines and a midpoint. I have respondents mark their estimated preferences with an X. I explain that the placement of the X is to indicate how certain they are that the preference that they have selected is actually the most natural. So that X represents certainty rather than an amount of the preference. Now here's a profile for a pretty clear reported type, and there are many ways in which to present the preference pairs for discussion. Most common is to take them in the order of the profile. The challenge with this approach is that each pair may appear to the respondent as discrete and unrelated to the others. They can often come across as being very trait-like, with PCEyes sounding like amounts and scores, and we really want respondents to understand the concept of whole type. Combining the preferences as you begin the discussion often makes this easier for respondents to grasp when they actually get to the end. I think with this profile, I would usually start with SN. We'll talk in a minute about how I would describe each one of those, and then I'd follow with TF, and then probably explain the SF, heart of type. SFs are sympathetic and friendly. They're attracted to career fields that provide practical service to others. Since most of us are doing career counseling and advising, this is the part of type that suggests career fields. The EI and JP orientations then suggest specific positions within the field. I apologize, I'm having trouble with my voice today. If any of you have ever been to Lake Tahoe, we don't have very much oxygen up here. We're having a lot of wind and strange weather, and I just lose my voice when that happens. Okay, so we've talked about the heart of type and how it relates to career fields, and EI and JP would then narrow down positions within the career fields. I'd then probably talk about EI as the preferred focus of the heart of type, and of course the source of energy, and JP is how they want to live their heart of type in their everyday lives. And I'll come back when we talk about TypeDynamics to how this process might vary with different profile configurations. First, I'd like to talk about some ways to use keywords and open-ended questioning to verify the best fit preferences. I'm going to use SN and TF as examples. You want to keep emphasizing all the way through that we all use all 8 preferences. What we're looking for is which is the most natural for the student or client in each pair. So I'll say something like sensing and intuition are 2 different ways that people take in information. People who prefer sensing like to take in information that's real and tangible. This is right from Introduction to Type, by the way. They pay attention to what's actually happening. They're observant about the specifics of what is going on around them and are especially attuned to practical realities. They use what they've experienced in the past as a standard against which to evaluate the present. Then I'll ask, when is a time, would you share a time that this might describe you? And I do that before I talk about the opposite preference. And I make sure that they can connect with some example where they've used sensing and they know it's sensing. Then I go on to intuition. People who prefer intuition like to take in information by seeing the big picture, focusing on the relationships and connecting between facts. They want to grasp patterns and are especially attuned to seeing new possibilities. They take what they're experiencing and imagine how they would do it differently in the future. And then I'll ask, how about these words and phrases? Would you share a time or an event or an activity when you see yourself using intuition? Does one of these feel more natural than the other? And which one is it? Now sometimes the answer comes right away. Sometimes an example might be needed. Maybe looking at learning style can be helpful when considering a preference, especially for sensing and intuition. And here's an example. For instance, these 2 types differ in only 1 letter, S versus N. It's dominant for both. That 1 letter makes a huge difference in how students learn best. I'll leave this up for a minute so you can see those differences. I'll say something like, we all use both of these functions, S and N, sometimes so quickly that it's hard to tell which might be our natural preference. I like to think of function preferences as where we go first, because we always go to both. For instance, when working on a project, some students will start by gathering a lot of information. searching the internet, taking notes, making lists, trying things out. The process tends to be pretty sequential. They start at the beginning and keep adding pieces of information. And if people ask them what they're doing, they'll respond with a lot of facts and evidence from past experience. The information will eventually come together so they can state kind of a big picture summary of what they're working on. And that's as they move from sensing into intuition. Other students will immediately get a big picture in their minds of what they want to do and then do some information gathering to fill in the blanks and complete the picture. The order in which they gather the information isn't necessarily in sequence. They're more likely to focus on what interests them the most, sometimes even starting in the middle of the project and working their way out to the edges. And if people ask them what they're doing, they'll refer to the big picture first, and then they'll come back to sensing and fill in the blanks. Then I'll follow the same process with thinking versus feeling, but I want to tie it right into the respondent's estimated preference for sensing or intuition. Again, emphasizing that all of these preferences are intertwined. So I'll say something like, as we take in sensing experiences and facts, or intuition ideas and concepts, we prioritize their importance in order to make decisions. We tend to give more weight to and hold on to information that fits with either logical or personal criteria. People who prefer thinking look first at the logical consequences of a choice or action as they're prioritizing information. They want to remove themselves from the situation to examine the pros and cons objectively. They're energized by critiquing and analyzing to identify what's wrong with something so they can solve the problem. This is the problem-solving thinking preference. Their goal is to find a standard or principle that will apply in similar situations. Now, people who prefer feeling first consider the personal impact of a decision on themselves and on others. They mentally place themselves into the situation to identify with everyone so that they can make decisions based on their person-centered values. And they're energized by appreciating and supporting others, and they look for qualities to praise. Their goal is to create harmony and treat each person as a unique individual. Just as we did in S versus N, ask for examples from respondents' own lives of when they've used each. And for instance, you can relate it back to the student project example that I had up for SN, something like this. At some point, a decision actually has to be made about what you're going to turn in for the project. And when deciding, some students will first consider something personal. I really like this stuff. Or if I work on this topic rather than that one, I could really help the second graders I work with. Or maybe working on this topic would help me to understand my family better. Other students will first consider something that just makes logical sense for them to do. If I work on this project, it will help me to find a job. Or this project fits in with what I did last semester. It makes sense that I expand my research now so that when I get to my senior thesis, I'll have most of it done already. Or this project would allow me to take charge and really make something happen. So these more in the T direction. At this point, I'm intentionally leaving out type dynamics. I'm just talking about how we basically present type descriptions so that respondents can, as accurately as possible, estimate their own type. TypeDynamics deals more with how S or N and T or F might be different in their extroverted and introverted orientations. This is usually too much information for the initial introduction to type, but we'll show, we're going to pause after the next slide, and we'll show after the pause how to bring that information in when respondents' best types are still unclear. We're going to pause after this slide, so if you have questions, you might want to send them to Karen now so that I'll have them to respond to. Sometimes after describing S, N, T, and F, comparing the two hearts of type, the middle two letters, will help students to find clarity on S, N, and T, F preferences. For instance, comparing S, F, N, F and S, T, N, T. I think when I look at this, I think of SF as the social work model of counseling, and NF as the therapy model. ST is a deductive approach. It's kind of scientific and business-like. NT is more of an inductive approach. Once you have this heart of type, you can move to the orientations. Whether interaction with others or reflection and solitude gives them the most energy, and how they want to live their heart of type in their daily lives, planning how they will do things or responding as things they occur, that JP difference. I'm going to stop here because we're going to take it to a slightly deeper level of complexity. Karen, are there some questions that I should address at this point, do you think?
So there is one that came in a little earlier, and let me just clarify something real quick again. We do not make the PowerPoint slides available, so for anyone that has those questions, just to answer it now. We are recording this webinar. We will post it on our website in about 2 weeks. So just in case we get any more of those questions, I wanted to answer that up front. So we got one from Joe. Joe says, would love to hear Judy expand more on her advice to avoid anecdotal descriptions and stick to tested definitions. I tend to use a mix and find that the anecdotal examples especially help bring clarity to those definitions. What is the cost of using anecdotal examples while examining the preferences?
Great question, Joe. The challenge with anecdotal descriptions is bias. It's practically impossible to present anecdotal evidence or anecdotal descriptions without our own type bias coming into how we frame the anecdotes. I'm not saying that I don't use them. I do, but in the initial run-through, I refer first to the keywords and phrases that have been defined as accurately representing type. We want to make sure that we're not adding our own connotations to things. What I do more often is kind of what I did with that example about working on a project. I might present the keywords and phrases, ask for examples from their life of how they see themselves using the keywords and phrases for sensing, for instance, or for intuition. As they're sharing with me, I don't have any problem with joining the discussion with corrections. I hate to be a TJ corrector type, but if I describe sensing and then say, talk to me about how you use that in your life, and they share something that where I hear intuition, I'll say, let me describe intuition now and see if you don't think what you just shared with me is more in that direction than the other direction. And that's where I would bring in the anecdotes. It would be after we've initially presented the dichotomy and discussed some examples from them. I hope that helps. It's a tough line. It's really a tough line. More experienced users it's easier, I think, for us to pull on anecdotes. When you're first learning, it's tough.
Thank you. Here's another from Deidre. In quotes, it says, which of these tends to be what you consider first? And she asks, aren't there situations or people who consider only one of them, the T or the S? I have found when a person considers one first and then the other tends to be more in the mid-zone than clear.
Well, developed type considers all four functions, S, N, T, and F. And what's natural is where you just naturally go. And going, for instance, someone who prefers intuition and naturally forms a big picture first and then feeds in the sensing data, that's a clear preference for intuition. But intuition can't stand alone. I think maybe I'm not understanding what you're saying. The point of what I'm trying to get across is that when we're verifying type with someone, we want to make sure that they understand that getting their type right isn't the point of all of this. Type is about exploring who we are and how we use all four of those, of the middle two letters, the S, N, T, and F. And we use them in different ways. But there's a natural tendency with almost everyone to start somewhere. And that's the natural preference, but it's only half the picture. I hope that's okay. I know that it sounds like, Deirdre, we could have a one-on-one discussion about that, I think.
Great. Here's another from Tanya. So
just
gave a workshop on communication in-house. And both of the INTJs present already verified beforehand, started questioning whether they were actually ISFJ. Goodness, any suggestions how I could have better help them verify their type beforehand, or suggestions for how to help them now?
So you had INTJs who verified ISFJ? Did I hear that correctly, Karen?
Let me repeat it. So just give a workshop. Both INTJs already verified beforehand started questioning whether they were actually ISFJs.
Okay, all right. I suspect that what might have happened is there was some group dynamics going on. They may have been hearing some group pressure around SF. That happens a lot, where you'll start questioning your own type in the presence of other types. And I think that Tanya's question is going to be addressed when we talk about type dynamics. Communication starts with JP. I mean, what is it that comes out of the person's mouth? And so when you're doing a workshop or verifying type around communication issues, it's about what they express and what they keep internally. And it may be that there was some confusion around how they're using your preferences. An INTJ, for instance, will very often extrovert feeling. That's their tertiary function. And INTJs introvert sensing, which is their inferior function, and they'll often say that they feel like ISJs. And it's that NJ tension. There's that N that's N, it's big picture, and that's that J that's focused and overlaps with sensing. So I've had INTJs sometimes fluctuate back and forth between INTJ and ISTJ. The F is a whole other issue. It could be type development, and we'll be talking about some of that.
Thanks. Here's another from Laura. Do some of the heart types get along better with the other heart types? How is conflict handled between these hearts and columns?
We need to do a webinar on that, Karen.
Topics. We're looking for topics, by the way, everybody. So
I don't. That sounds like another Valentine's Day topic. You know, I can't say that. I just think that's really subjective, and there's so many factors in who gets along with whom. I've had kind of a guideline that I keep going back to in my life, and it may be because my dominant N married a dominant N, but I often feel that the hearts that have SN in common are starting at least with a common language, and so that's sometimes easier. But in our Valentine's Day webinar, we talked about all of that, and then we said, but in the end, it's all about love, and love trumps type. So that's about as far as I'll go with that one. Let's just let's try one more, Karen, and then we'd better go on because some of these questions are overlapping where we're going, I think.
Okay, great. Let's see. Here is one from Gary. Oh, actually, I had a couple from Gary. So this one here, he says, comment. I'm a very clear NT, need to understand. However, what drives my need to understand is the desire to get it right, to foster my need to increase competence around those around me. It would be easy for someone to be confused and rhetorically ask, am I an NT or an ST?
I agree.
And his other question was, is there a text or workbook that you recommend that goes more into detail, that goes into your presentation with more detail?
Let me address the first question first. Gary, the NT has a need to appear competent and to feel competent. And of course, a lot of it depends on whether what's going on with J or P. NTJs especially are driven to appear competent, and that very often requires the mastery of sensing. And so very often when you're talking to NTJ types, they'll be identifying with sensing because they're equating that with competence. So I see that. In terms of what we're talking about, going into it in more detail, I pulled for this webinar from basic MBTI certification, which is what I've covered up to this point, which is how to present type, how to estimate it, how to administer it, how to use the results, that kind of thing. What we're going into in a minute is more type dynamics and development. The best reference, the best simple reference I use for that is the CPP booklet, Introduction to Type Dynamics and Development. Karen, let me go on a little bit and talk about EI. And then start getting to some really unclear profiles, and I think more questions will come in related to that.
Great, thank you.
Okay. I mentioned that that pacing, how results are presented to someone, how the type verification process takes place is very important. And I'm using this concept because I want to make a point about ESFP and ESTP types that's sometimes overlooked. And I have something I want to describe, and it has to do with pacing. This has to do with listening for how respondents phrase things. And you want to match the energy level of the client as you're discussing their results. It's really necessary to bump up verbal energy when you hear extroversion and to leave time for reflection when you hear introversion. And ESP types probably illustrate this point the best. Most ESTP, it's hard to say this, most ESTP and ESFP types have about a 5-minute attention span if they're not physically doing something. And as the practitioner, you can usually see ESP right away. They extrovert dominant sensing. And if you're sitting with them one-to-one, they'll fidget and they'll change positions. They'll play with things around them. They'll listen for a few minutes if you're asking them to respond every minute or so. You also have the advantage of the report. So if the PCEyes is higher than 5 in the E direction, there's good reason to believe that the reported preference for extroversion is correct. And with these types, when I see ESTP and ESFP type, and I can usually pick it up in the first 5 minutes of a discussion with someone, when I see it, I present type differently. I start with a very brief demonstration of what preferences are, usually writing their name or doing something that they can relate to. I've worked with a lot of student athletes over the years, and many ESTP and ESFP types are athletes. So it's great to toss them a ball if you have one. I keep a ball in my office. Here's a trick for every career counselor to keep something in their office that they can do sports with during the interpretation. I'll toss them a ball, and when they catch it, ask them to tell you how they use each hand. You can count on them identifying which one leads and which one supports in the process of catching. And right away you've got the ESP engaged. Then we literally play cards. And I have a deck of cards that I modified slightly from the key words and phrases in Introduction to Type. One phrase on one side of each card and its opposite phrase on the other side. And each side is coded for the preference. So I'll have the students sort the cards. Choose a side for each card, talk to me about it, and share examples from their own life, and then put the card down with the preferred side up. When all the cards have been sorted, type has pretty well been estimated. We look at the brief whole type description on page 13 in Introduction to Type to verify, and then compare with the report. And what I found is that ESP respondents will remain engaged in this process for about a half an hour, which is a long time for these two types. The process is lively, it's physically engaging, and it's fast. And they're sharing, as they look at each card, they're sharing their personal experiences. So you've got a lot to work off of as you go further into the verification process. Now, ISTP and ISFP types also respond to this format pretty well, but they need more time to process each card. Now, some of you I know are already thinking about TypeDynamics. Changing the P to a J in each of these types changes everything. ESTJ and ESFJ types are active, but they don't process information physically. They store what they hear and experience and are much more interested in the outcome than in the process of getting there. We've been using a fairly clear ESFJ profile as an example. I showed this profile to you earlier. And now I'm going to run through very quickly some profiles that are less clear and then come back and see how we can adjust how we talk about the different preference pairs to adjust the clarity issues. This is where TypeDynamics begins to come into play. For instance, when the dominant is slight, as in this case, that F preference, which would be dominant, is slight. It could be someone who's initially developing dominant F or T. It could also be someone who's clear about F or T, but who's integrating the other side, such as mid-career. And with profiles like this, I'll usually start with EI or JP, which will most likely fall into place, and then spend the majority of our time together on the heart of type, the middle two letters. It's even more challenging when the dominant, or is it, we don't really know, is slight and the JP orientation is also slight. With this configuration, I usually begin with EI and then move to SN and TF. While we're talking about the middle two letters, what I'm doing is listening for which of those middle two letters is extroverted and which of those middle two letters is introverted. And that's going to give me the direction for JP. Here's another one that we're seeing a lot right now. This is when just EI and JP are clear, but the mental functions, the heart of type, is unclear. We see a lot of this configuration in millennial students, especially college freshmen. It's very challenging. They seem to want answers now, but their sense of self isn't developed enough to get them. And when we can't give them answers, they get frustrated. And profiles like this one suggest a need to live everyday life in a very J way, but they don't have any clarity about what to J with. And it makes sense to me to begin a discussion of the profile with what's clear. It'll give you the extroverted and introverted orientations of SN and TF and may help you to clarify those when you get to them. I also don't like to frustrate people right out of the gate with what I know they're going to have a lot of lack of uncertainty around. And so especially with a profile like this, I'm going to start, EI is easier to talk about. JP is easier to talk about. You don't have the introverted and extroverted orientations of the middle two letters going on. Here's another one that's really challenging for me, and nothing's really clear at all except maybe P. And you want to keep in mind that the reliability of results decreases as PCEyes decrease. We can't make any assumptions at all about the accuracy of the E, S, and F preferences in this profile. I begin with JP. It's easy to talk about how they like to live their daily lives, and maybe we'll hear some clues to the middle two letters. Since I mentioned reliability, I'd like to make just a couple of points about it. It kind of makes sense that the more sure a person is of their natural preference, the more consistently they will respond to the indicator and the more reliable the results will be. If all of the preferences are clear, they might not even be seeking career counseling in the first place. It's always been interesting to me that the textbooks and college classes on assessment tend to present profiles where everything's clear and fits together, and most of our clients are great big question marks. Now, the instrument isn't any less valid when PCEyes are slight. It's the results that we're questioning, and that's why so much relies on the practitioners and how we talk about type. In fact, when PCEyes are slight, it's good for us to know that because we want to find out why, and the indicator puts the questions right out on the table. And always keep in mind that the indicator only gives us reported type. Best fit emerges from the type verification process. And even PCEyes of 1 are more likely to be accurate on the MBTI Form M than on any other assessment that claims to indicate type. We want to keep in mind that we don't use a static interpretation, which is matching respondents up with majors and careers without a verified type. This is another unclear profile that I found challenging. I always call it the I want to work with people profile. And the question then becomes, how do you want to work with people? And I bring in the heart of type. Do you want to work with them to get things right? Or do you want to help them with practical resources? Or do you want to empower them through your insights and creativity? Or strategize with them to solve problems? There will always be the person who says they can't choose, that they don't know, or they want to do them all. And this might very well be an unclear identity. It may not even be career counseling or coaching that we're talking about. We have to keep in mind that the MBTI and the Strong, which I often use as well, are restricted assessments, and they provide snapshots of who the person is at one moment in time. Whatever issues a person is dealing with will be likely to show up in the results, and we have to be able to recognize them and even make referrals if that becomes necessary. Also keep in mind that slight PCEyes don't always mean that a person's unclear about that preference. And clear PCEyes don't always mean that a person is clear. They only represent how consistently the person answered the questions as they took the assessment. That's why our instructions are so important. This is probably the most complicated type of profile, the most challenging to verify. This person could actually be any one of 16 types. And I always start, when I see a profile like this, before the respondent sees it, I always begin with reassuring them that type is never meant to restrict us to one set of behaviors over another. And I'd certainly start with the handedness exercise, something like that, so that they can see, so that they're experiencing what natural is. Might be a good idea to talk this person through what it was like for them to answer the questions. Maybe it wasn't a typical day for them. Maybe they were instructed to answer the questions according to how they were at work. And maybe her true type is not who they are at work. Or you might find out that the answers were going back and forth between who this person really is and what he or she thinks is expected of her. Talking through the preference pairs, I'd probably start with the middle two letters and see if we can narrow those down and go to the descriptions of the 4 hearts of type. We're going to pause in just a minute before we go into the actual specifics of TypeDynamics if you're thinking of questions. Keep in mind some things that are behind unclear type, especially unclear reported type. External expectations are often play a big part in how we answer the questions to the MBTI. Sometimes expectations of the work environment are apparent. Some people attach negative connotations to some of the words. Introversion, introverted for instance, judging or judgmental. And sometimes there really is a lack of identity development. I mean, this is, remember that people who are in college especially are figuring out who they are. And that figuring out is what often shows up in the profile itself. Sometimes the MBTI is taken in a situation of authority. What comes to mind when I was putting this together is several years ago I was doing a presentation for the California Bar Association, and there were 125 lawyers in a big room, and we were using the self-scorable version of the MBTI. And what went on that day was that the person who hosted that conference, that meeting, talked about type before lunch when I wasn't there. And the way he talked about it, he communicated very clearly that there was only one right type for lawyers. And then he gave, and that type he thought was his type. And then he gave them all the self-scorable version of the MBTI to take during lunch. And then they came back and I had the afternoon session. And it was, I had about 3 hours with them. And we scored them all. You know, we went through the self-scoring thing, and it was really interesting that almost everybody in the room came out with the type that the person who had presented the afternoon session had represented as his own. I mean, it was clearly responding to that person in a position of authority. It certainly wrecked all the activities and exercises we were going to do that afternoon. Sometimes the MBTI is taken at a time of transition or stress, maybe the first week away at college or just being laid off or in the middle of a divorce or something like that. Personality integration, the midlife thing, when we tend to integrate less preferred functions, plays a big part in how we answer the questions. And of course there are other factors that we have to ask about. Before we pause, I want to talk just a little bit about the complexity of how this instrument is constructed, because this is where people struggle. This is why they're struggling. And students will often say something along the lines of, I didn't like either of the choices, or I liked them both, I couldn't choose. And this is because the choices, you know, each question on the MBTI is presented with a choice. It's called forced choice, and they're not logical. There's psychological opposites rather than logical opposites. And each choice is equally desirable or equally good. And as an example, think of this question. If you were asked to answer the question, do you consider yourself more of an organized person or a disorganized person? I don't think a lot of people would choose that second option and say that they're disorganized. These choices are logical opposites, but one is much more desirable than the other. And so the MBTI question that you're asked to choose between is between organized and spontaneous. These are psychological opposites, and a lot of people feel a pull between the two. They represent the two poles of judging and perceiving. And you're asked to choose between these 4 pairs of psychological opposites in many different ways, and it's your pattern of responses that generates the type and indexes on the profile. When people understand this, sometimes it's easier for them to see why it's difficult for them to arrive at a type. I'm going to pause here again for a few minutes before we actually go into the mechanics of laying out type dynamics in the type verification process. Karen?
Okay.
Hello, Karen.
I'm here. Okay, so we have one from Keith. How would you go about explaining JP before SN? Since JP relates to SN and TF, shouldn't you explain those first?
The basic concept of JP, I understand where you're coming from. Did you say Keith?
Yes.
Is this person's name Karen? There's a basic concept of JP that's usually pretty easy for people to grasp, which is how do you like to live your daily life? Do you like to have a plan for how you're going to go about the day, or do you like to be more open to respond to whatever happens? It's that basic concept. When we talk about it this way, we're not bringing SN and TF into it. If you're going to use type dynamics in the verification process, you can, depending on the configuration of the profile. But I think I've often found that JP is one of the easier ones to identify as long as the person isn't confusing how they should be with how they really are. That doesn't say that the way that you're doing it isn't correct. I mean, it's just, I think I'm sharing here what's worked for me, especially in challenging situations, and you may have something that's worked for you, and share it.
Thanks. We actually got several questions regarding the cards that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So people are basically, they were a little curious about them. So they asked where they can get them, basically, like who sells these cards.
Oh, I don't sell them. They're index cards is all they are that I've made up from the keywords and phrases in Introduction to Type. And I use those. That was when I was talking about the ESP types. ESP types aren't into reading so much, and they're not into listening so much, but they're really into doing things with their hands. And so if you take what's written and summarize it on a card and have it flipped to both sides, their hands are doing something. There are some type games out there, and I put that in quotes, that help people to sort their type into the correct type, but they're games. And I don't want to confuse that with what I'm doing. It's just a different way of presenting the same information that I would present if I were reading it right out of the booklet.
Great. Thanks. Here's a question from Erica. On the ESFP slide, where all preferences are so slight, how do you help the person choose a preference? In my experience, these types of people feel that they can go either way depending on the situation, that they have had a hard time picking between two preferences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, when all 4 preferences are slight, that's exactly what's going on. They feel that they go both directions. And that's why I don't ask people to make a choice. I acknowledge that they go in both directions and ask them which one they go to most naturally first. And it's where do you go first rather than which do you prefer. And that gets to it. I'm also in a minute going to describe an exercise I use with someone who just won't narrow it down at all. And that might help. I'm going to leave it until we get to that slide, though, because it's related to the slide.
Okay, so here is one from Sarah. Let's see here. Question is about matching our pacing to the client. Any suggestions as to how to work with this if we're working in a group workshop?
Yeah, do both. Do both. I mean, first of all, when you're in a group workshop, assume you've got introverts. Our tendency with a group is to feed off of group energy. Even introverted presenters, introverted facilitators will be energized by a group who's interacting. And just keep remembering that when you present content, for every content piece, it's going to take the introvert anywhere between 5 and 15 seconds to digest what you said. And so what I'll usually do, and I think most presenters do, is I'll present something in a very extroverted way first, very quickly. And then I'll say it again, briefly, and then pause. So you're getting the extroverted energy up front, and then you've got the reflection. When I'm presenting the 4 preference pairs, I'll have an extroverted and an introverted exercise around each pair, so that we'll talk about it, and then we'll reflect about it. It's hard. It's hard.
Great. Okay, let's see. We have some good ones. Here's another from, can strength of PCI be interpreted as providing a sense of rigidity? In other words, flexible versus inflexible in one's preferences?
No. I startled you, Karen, didn't I? I didn't have anything else to say.
You did. I was waiting for more.
PCEyes don't come in strong and weak. PCEyes are just clarity. And no, I think one of the most common misinterpretations of PCEyes is that high PCEyes are rigidly in that direction and low PCEyes are flexible. And that's just not what it's about.
Great. Let's see. Eileen says, Judy mentioned the 4 hearts of type. Could you ask her to briefly explain that term?
The 4 hearts of type refer to the middle 2 letters of type, which are the cognitive processes or the mental functions of Carl Jung, and they represent our identity, essentially, how we take in information and how we evaluate the information that we're taking in. And each heart of type is driven by something different. And STs are driven to get it right. And SFs are driven to provide practical help. And NFs are driven to empower others through creativity. And NTs are driven to master knowledge, to understand. And it's just the core of who we are. And those 4 hearts of type are linked to career fields. And we've done some webinars on that, where we specifically identify the career fields and then bring in EIJP to expand on actual job titles within the career fields. And those webinars are archived on the CPP website, so we can go back and look at them. Let's do 2 more, Karen, and then we better do some TypeDynamics stuff.
Great. Okay, here's Laura. So when SN or TF is unclear on reported type, and a student has trouble deciding after each type is described, is talking about heart of type dynamics the best step for helping them clarify that unclear preference?
I think if one of the 2 is unclear, I think the heart of type can really help. We're going to talk about TypeDynamics now in just a minute, and what I've found sometimes is that when you're helping people to estimate type, especially if we get anecdotal about it and we're talking about SN and TF, we have to be sure and cover SN and TF in both their extroverted and introverted orientations. And I'm going to demonstrate this in a minute, but extroverted sensing, that would be an SP type, and introverted sensing, an SJ type, experience sensing very differently. And so when we're choosing our examples, we have to make sure that we get some of the physical SP stuff and some of the storing of information SJ stuff in the way that we're talking about it. And when we use TypeDynamics that way, it can be very helpful, and then the heart of type definitions will sometimes reinforce.
Okay, the last one from Diane. I had a college freshman who took the MBTI and reported ENTJ, the same as her mother. But individual type
I'm sorry, I couldn't help but laugh. I'm sorry.
individual type counseling indicated ESTP. Is it possible that stress contributed to her skewed reported type?
Yeah. I mean, stress affects how we answer the questions a lot. And I think did I hear college freshman?
Yes.
And so there's that whole transitioning away from the parents to discovering who you are that happens during the freshman year. So yeah, I think that's a real possibility. ENTJ and ESTP are very, very different. And if she really is an ESTP, and mom has been TJing her with dominant extroverted thinking for 18 years, that transition, there's going to be a lurch. That's a big leap, and the freshmen, that transition from high school to college and from parents to non-parental decision making with an ENTJ parent is going to be felt. Okay, let's talk specifically about some of this type dynamic stuff. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Is it okay to go on?
Yes, go ahead.
Got to get back into my move these little PowerPoints forward here. Here we go. We've been talking a lot about a pretty static approach to verifying type, choosing between NT and NF, for instance, or between S and N. And TypeDynamics kicks type verification up a notch and helps when just choosing isn't enough. Choosing between types isn't enough. This respondent is a pretty good example. She's debating between ISTJ and ISFJ, and you can see that the TF is slight. In this type, if you're using TypeDynamics in this profile, TF appears to be the auxiliary function pair. And you notice that thinking has a slight PCI. She identifies, she says equally, with both ST, driven to get it right, and SF, providing practical help to others. She's an academic advisor. She sees what she does, providing helpful information to students, as providing practical help. So she's identifying with the SF stuff. But her favorite part of her job is teaching students the right way to plan their academic careers. Her favorite project ever was developing an academic advising workbook for students and a manual of policies and procedures for her department. Now the question is about what motivates her the most, helping students with the information or teaching them the right way to use it. No matter how much we talked about ST and SF, she kept saying that she identified with both equally. This is what the practitioner looks for. Now, sometimes it's enough just to listen to how they use words and talk and say so. So in this case, I might say to her as she's talking, I'm actually hearing more ST than SF. And that's a lot of what type verification and reaching best fit type is. You as the practitioner, you as the expert are listening and providing feedback on what you hear. You're not telling them their type, you're just saying, I'm hearing more of this than that, or right now I'm hearing this, now I'm hearing that. Now, TypeDynamics is complicated. And the key to using it and finding the best fit type is remembering some very basic guidelines. And I've summarized them up here. Sensing intuition, SN, is the perceiving part of our personality. We all have a P piece, and it's the S or the N. And thinking, feeling is the judging part of our personality. It's not we're J's or we're P's. It's we all have P and we all have J. And we perceive the world around us with SN, and we evaluate our perceptions with TF. Now here's the second piece, and if you haven't seen this before, I know that it just comes in like an overwhelming ball of information. So I'm just going to introduce it and give you a couple of examples. Now the types that end in P types, extrovert perception. So they extrovert sensing or intuition. When P types are talking, we hear sensing, we hear intuition, we hear experiences, we hear information, we hear ideas. The types that end in J extrovert their judging function, either thinking or feeling. When J types talk, we hear outcomes. How a program being discussed will fit with the overall structure of student personnel services, for instance, T logic, or how it will benefit students, F personal values. This is a graphic of what it looks like. Many of you have seen it before. JP points to what we extrovert. JP points to the one of the middle two letters that we extrovert, and EI then determines which of the middle two letters is dominant. And it's not as important for the type dynamics discussion that I'm going to have here, although it's important in the overall type. And this graphic illustrates why we don't refer to people as P's or J's, because we all have both. So let's go back to our respondent with the ISTJ-ISFJ dilemma. Her name is Linda, at least that's what I'm calling her, and this is how she responded to my question about new advising procedures that are in the works in her department. Remember, she said that she sees what she does as an academic advisor, providing helpful information to students, as providing practical help. But she also said that her favorite part of her job is teaching students the right way to plan their academic careers. This is what she says. We've been mandated to make our advising procedures more efficient. We now have steps A, B, C, and D. We're computerizing steps C and D and integrating the information with what they're doing in the Career Center. We'll accomplish the same thing we're doing now in fewer student contact hours. Everyone will benefit. We won't be so overloaded, and students will get the information they need faster. This is the difference between TJ and FJ. Notice that Linda mentions both logical outcomes and how they will benefit students and staff, but she goes to logic first. As the MBTI practitioner, it's appropriate to point this out. She doesn't have any difficulty verifying her preference for judging, so we know that TF is going to be about how she implements decisions. Not just how she makes them, but how she gets them done. So I might say something like, and this is just a script I might use, I can hear that you're struggling between these two types and really want to get it right. There's an ST clue right there if she's struggling to get it right. Just to give you some feedback, when I asked you to tell me about the program that you're working on, I heard you evaluating, in fact justifying, the new procedures based on logic. Of course, I also heard you say how the new procedures will benefit the people you care about, your students and colleagues, but I heard you go to logic first. What do you make of what I'm saying? Now, an ISFJ Linda responding to the same question might begin her story with something like this. Students come into our office for their advising appointments, and they always have to wait. And sometimes we get so far behind that we have to use our walk-in time for catch-up. I sometimes feel like we're just testing and telling and not really preparing them for what lies ahead. I want to really be able to spend time getting to know them during our initial meeting. By putting some of our basic information online and integrating some of our services with what the Career Center does, we'll be able to give the administrators the efficiency they want while at the same time being more helpful to students. Now, those of you who are already familiar with TypeDynamics know that if JP were in question and thinking were clear, we could talk about both the E and I orientations of thinking. If she identifies with the extroverted thinking description, that would suggest J and vice versa. This gives you for those of you who are new to this is the complexity of TypeDynamics, but it's also the value of it. I'm going to give you an example that I experienced actually fairly recently. This is an example of just two types where the only difference is J and P. ISTP types always have their hands on something, and they're very physical. I'm using this example because I think it shows why we have to be very careful about the examples we use of SN, T, and F, that we're showing them in both the introverted and extroverted orientations. The ISTP types always have to have their hands on something. They're very physical, and while they're taking in information through their hands and other senses, that's extroverted sensing, they're analyzing what they're doing with their dominant introverted thinking. They're on-the-spot problem solvers. They then physically try out their solutions. My favorite example is a pair of appliance repairmen who were at my house one day diagnosing and rebuilding my almost new washing machine. And that's key because the washing machine was only a few months old and it literally broke down. And so they didn't have a big history of the problem. So we had this pair of appliance repairmen who were at the house. It was a huge job and took a lot of work just to figure out what the problem was. One of the repairmen was an ISTJ. He read the manual cover to cover. He called the manufacturer. He researched the forums online. He gathered every bit of information that had ever been documented. This is ISTJ. The other repairman was an ISTP. He sat on the floor in the laundry room with his hands on each side of the machine, holding it, and just listened and felt it through an entire cycle. And when it was done, he said, "It's a bearing." The other guy looked up from his tablet, he was using an iPad, and said, "There's someone here on the forum who had trouble with the main bearing." Now, I was standing outside the laundry room listening and watching this whole thing because they were, of course, interviewing me through it, and I just said, ISTP, ISTJ. Here it is right in front of me. And we can also use TypeDynamics as a backdoor into Type. And some of you participated in the webinar that Patrick Kerwin did on stress last fall, and he demonstrated this as well. This is a man in his 50s, I've called him Larry, and he's enjoyed a career in human resources and training and development. And a year ago he made the decision to leave corporate employment for a work environment that was more in line with his personal values, and he accepted a position as the Director of Career Development at a large university. Now, he's in a team building exercise with his staff, and everyone is really surprised to see him put his name in the ENFP cell of the type table. He's actually a little hesitant about putting it there himself. And as the day goes on, he hears from his staff that they perceive him as ST, and not ST at its best. It seems to be almost extreme. His micromanaging style is very rigid, and he spends most of his time telling people what they're doing wrong. "That's not how we did it in the business world," is his very favorite phrase. Larry was puzzled, and his introverted feeling function was deeply hurt. A coach in the university's HR department agreed to help him understand his type a little better. Larry was under stress. When he applied for his position, the hiring committee was so excited about his corporate experience and his vision for university career development. He was asked to develop and carry out a 3-year plan to move the department in a new direction. He couldn't wait to collaborate with his staff of career development professionals and make it happen. But pretty soon after he started in his new position, he discovered there were no resources. His staff wasn't particularly collaborative, and they weren't exactly thrilled about the changes he was suggesting to the way they were doing their jobs. His inferior sensing function took over, accompanied by the reverse of introverted feeling, extroverted, supercritical judgment. Gaining an understanding of the dynamics of his type, Larry learned to do 2 things: manage his stress and develop the ST aspects of his ENFP personality in more positive ways. His negative response to stress actually helped him to verify his ENFP type. I wanted to mention Larry because verifying a 4-letter type and matching it up with majors and career fields is only one approach to applying type to career development. We also want to be prepared to deal with the other side of our clients' types, both under stress and when we're integrating the other side of our types in later life maturity. One way to help clients, especially adult clients, to integrate their less preferred functions is to go a little bit deeper, and we can do that with the MBTI Step 2. The MBTI Step 2 generates a 4-letter type, but it also generates 20 subscales that are called facets. This is the ISTJ profile, different colors than what we've been looking at, but it's the same Form M profile. This man is in his early 40s. He's in a graduate program in organizational psychology. His reported type is a clear ISTJ. He verified INTJ. And this is why. Here are the SN facets, the 5 SN facets. And do you see that on experiential theoretical, he scores in the theoretical direction, and in fact he really enjoys studying the theoretical frameworks of psychology. He said that when he was younger he really was sensing, but now he thinks his type has changed. We know that type is a genetic imprint and doesn't change, and the Step 2 brought him to an understanding with some data of what's really going on. He's developing his less preferred intuition function. And in fact, when people want to consciously develop their less preferred functions, the Step 2 can often point the way to do that. I'm going to close this with, with an example of something. Some people just aren't able to verify a type. And we want to make sure that they understand that we're not trying to tell them their types. We don't want the process to become frustrating. We want to use it to identify starting points. And this was brought home with an initial type verification that I was doing a few weeks ago, where a student absolutely refused to choose a type. We spent, it was a 4-hour workshop, and we were meeting again the next day. She rejected her reported type. She insisted that she use all 8 preferences equally. And we all know that that isn't possible. The more I tried to work with her, the more stubborn she got that she wasn't any one of the 16 types. We were able to narrow it down to 8. For homework between classes, when the other students were researching occupations, I asked her to look up each of the 8 types in Introduction to Type and choose words and phrases from each of the full-page descriptions that she most identified with, essentially creating her own type description. She loved this approach. She felt unique, and she liked having a different assignment from everyone else. Not only did she come up with a description that she could live with, but in doing the exercise she eliminated 6 of the 8 types that she was considering. What she came up with was very close to INTP or possibly ENTP. And some of you are probably thinking what I was thinking at the time, that there's certain types that respond to their first introduction to type in this way. And you know what types they are, but you can't say what you think out loud. All you can say is what you hear. In this conversation, I'm hearing more intuition than sensing. What do the rest of you think? Was what you might say to the group. But you can't ever actually tell someone their type. I'm closing with that story just because I recognize, as we all do, that there are people who just can't verify. And we have to just leave it at where they are. A reminder that we're celebrating 70 years of type this year. MBTIparty.com is the website that highlights activities and resources that are going on related to that celebration. As usual, CPP is offering a 10% off, a 10% discount off of purchases. These are purchases within the U.S., not international purchases. There's a promotion code here, Expert513. To use it, make sure you use it as a discount on purchases before June 7th. There's several opportunities to join conversations with CPP online. There are LinkedIn groups, Facebook, Twitter, blog, and Pinterest. Some things that are coming up. CPP is offering public MBTI certification programs all summer in various parts of the country. You can learn more at cpp.com/MBTI certification. GS offers online MBTI certification for educators and career counselors. Enrollment is ongoing and it's self-paced. For that, you can go to gsconsultants.net. This webinar, like all of the CPP webinars, carries 1.5 NBCC, continuing education clock hours for CEUs, and also for master practitioner credit. Please request your certificate before Friday, June 7th, because that's when the certificate offer for this program will end. There's a late processing fee if you request after that date. The site to do that is cpp.com/AAE certificate. And it does take a few weeks to receive your certificate. Karen, do you want to say something about the email preferences?
Sure, thanks. So this is only for those of you, because sometimes we get emails that you're not receiving emails from CPP. So if you're not, this is a link to follow just to check your email preferences, because you may be unsubscribed and we're not allowed to send you anything. So you can just visit cpp.com/emailpress. I do want to make the mention that when you register for these webinars and you receive the confirmation and reminder emails, they're not actually coming from CPP. They're coming from this system called GoToWebinar. So it's a completely different system from us, and they don't look at unsubscribes or anything like that. So you will still get their emails. You just won't get our emails to invite you to future webinars or things like that. So just an FYI in case you're not getting our emails. So.
Thanks, Karen. Also, I want to remind people that if they want to take the MBTI and don't have access to a certified practitioner to go through the feedback with them, they can take it at mbticomplete.com. There is a charge for that. This is the official MBTI testing site. And there are probably some points of discussion or questions that have come in, and we've got just about 5 minutes. I'll keep this slide up, which introduces Jim and Jack. Jim and Jack are the educational representatives with CPP that are available to help you. And Jim, do you want to say hello so we can hear your sexy voice?
Hi, everybody. Judy, this has been a great webinar. You sure packed a lot into it. Thank you.
I know. I feel like a lot is packed in. Karen, what do you think? Are there a couple of questions that we can address quickly, do you think?
Well, let's hope so. Yeah, there's several questions. So,
I can imagine.
A quick mention. Thanks for all your tweets. And actually, currently, I'm blocked from Twitter because I went a little crazy and I started responding to everybody and retweeting. So I can't be on there for the next hour. So.
Oh, Karen, what does it mean when you're blocked from Twitter?
Yeah. So now I know. I will be, because I love responding to everybody, you know, right away, and I can't, so I'm not ignoring you.
You can tell Karen has an extroverted preference, if you don't mind me sharing. Talk about multitasking. You're managing the questions, you're organizing this webinar, and you're retweeting?
Yeah, it's a little crazy, but it's been fun.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, let's see.
I'm exhausted thinking about it.
Yeah, it's a little crazy. So this question is from Tanya. So my question revolves around shyness. I have had several types verify E, as shown on the MBTI as well, who tell me they were, as a child, very shy, but are now E adults. How would you help them understand the apparent change?
Well, shyness isn't equated with extroversion. Shyness is a trait, and it can go with either E or I. I'll just give a quick example. When introverts become confident in their content, they're not shy about it. You know, extroverts are more comfortable just talking. I mean, they generate their thoughts literally out loud. Introverts, as they mature into adulthood, become more and more confident about what they're interested in and become more talkative and less shy. But it is a trait, and it's a trait that can be addressed with some behavioral work. Whereas extroversion and introversion are not traits. We don't change them and develop them. Maybe that helps to differentiate a little bit. We actually talked about that, I think, in the webinar last month.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see here. Here's from Jacqueline. In your experience, are ESFP types more accurate in predicting type and reporting type towards validating types than other types?
I haven't experienced ESFP. I haven't experienced that. I wonder if Jacqueline has. What I find is that ESFP and ESTP types are overwhelmed in the type verification process, because it's and of course part of that is my own INTJ tendency to be overly theoretical, and that's why I developed the card sorts and, you know, playing ball with them and stuff like that, because it really connected with them. But I haven't seen that they have more trouble with the card sort. In fact, they just go right through it, just boom, 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 boom.
Great. Okay, let's see here. Here's one from Dr. Kathleen. When you say you might choose to go over JP first and then go to cores, are you talking about before they get their graph or while you are going over the graph with them?
No, before they get their graph. No, the graph is the final piece. It comes in at the very end when you're putting all the pieces together. So you're going over the preferences first and estimating, then you're talking about how they really are at work or at school, how they behave at work or at school, and then you present the graph. By the time you present the graph, you've done your discussing.
Okay, let's see. From Charmaine, I was told individuals with high PCEyes are in environments that support their preference. Would you agree?
That's an interesting point. And I've never heard it phrased that way, but I think that the more your natural preferences are supported by your parents and your environment, the clearer you're going to be about your preferences, which will probably come out with clear PCEyes. Jim, what do you think?
I agree. Yes.
Okay.
You'll want to mirror in the earlier years what you're seeing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Hopefully, you'll get parental encouragement to be more self-expressive and not just mirroring.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good way of saying it. Yeah, I think so. Probably one more, Karen, then we're going to be blocked from this as well as Twitter.
Yeah, too late with Twitter. Let's see here. We had another. Okay, so Joan is asking, if we have trouble confirming the step 1, would the client have to pay full price if we have them take the step 2?
Jim?
Yes, and in fact, the client would have to retake the assessment because the step 2 questionnaire is longer than the step 1 or the Form M. And yes, it would be an entirely new report. So yes, new report, new charge.
I know in private practice, what I've always done is I've started with a step 2.
Right.
I don't always use it. I don't always interpret it. I'll very often work from the step 1 profile that's at the beginning of step 2, and then bring in the facets if it's necessary to do so. If it's not necessary to do so, I don't even bring them up. Colleges and universities don't have the luxury of time sometimes or money, and so they use it. They have to be very careful about when they choose to use it, when they choose not to. Do you think that's probably a good point to stop with? We've done some interesting work this year with the step 2. We brought it up in several webinars, and I'm hoping that educators get a little more interested in it because it's a terrific way to expand our knowledge of type.
Yeah.
And Karen, it looks like the next time we'll get together is going to be next fall.
Yes, I know, in September. It seems so far away, but it'll be here really quickly.
And so people should maybe get in touch with us before August with ideas for webinars for next year.
Yeah, so actually I provided, when you all go and you request your certificate for CEUs or practitioner credits, in the survey that you fill out, it'll be a little different than the last times, and I actually added a question there to ask you, all of you, for feedback on topics. So feel free to share with us. Send them through there. Send them to me directly through email or even on our social media sites. I mean, I'm checking all that every single day, so would love to see your suggestions. So.
Yeah, I do too, and the sooner they come in, the more time it gives my introverted dominant intuition to mull over them.
Right, because we start the planning process, I mean,
right now.
Soon, yeah.
Tomorrow morning.
So, great. Okay, well, great. I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of your day for attending and asking such great questions. Also, thanks to all you tweeters. You had some really great tweets, and I was really happy to see them. As soon as it lets me log back on, I can go on there and announce the winners. So I'm anxious to do that. And thank you, Judy, as well, for sharing your great knowledge and expertise today. So this webinar now
thank you, Karen.
Yeah, concludes the 2012-2013 series. And like we said, we're going to begin the planning process for the next 2013-2014 series. And please, like I said, share your feedback. The next series will begin in September. So we usually post the schedule on our website, which is www.cbp.com/askanexpert around August. In the meantime, you can check out all of our recorded webinars. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar is being recorded. While the PowerPoint slides are not available, they're never available for this series, FYI, you can actually go on our website and just view all of the past recordings. So that concludes our webinar. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you, Karen.
Thanks. Bye-bye.